Thanks for inviting us in. This is the Delphi Debrief here on WTHR+. Day 16 of the Delphi murders trial saw the defense team for Richard Allen rest their case, but today continued with more testimony. In a moment, we'll hear from our WTHR legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. But first, let's get right to Delphi with our senior investigative reporter, Bob Siegel, and Samantha Johnson. So, Bob and Samantha, today started with a real surprise announcement from the defense.
Absolutely. There were two very memorable statements that came out of court today, one at the very beginning, one at the end. At 9:10 this morning, right after all the jurors had taken their seats, Judge Frances Gull asked defense attorney Brad Rosie. She said, "Mr. Rosie, you may call your first witness." And Mr. Rosie at that point said, very quickly, 5 words, "Your Honor, the defense rests." And that caught everybody off guard at that point. And then at the very end, again, we had another very memorable comment.
We did, and I told you a few minutes ago it was a statement that gave me goosebumps.
Yes.
And this one came from Judge Gull. It was towards the very end of the day, just after 2:15 this afternoon, when she addressed the jury directly, and she said, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard all the evidence in this case." And that felt like such a significant moment that now we're moving on to this next chapter. And between those two statements, from the beginning of the day and the very end of the day, hours of information,
Yes.
hours of conversation we heard in between, again, marking the end of a day and kind of this next chapter in this case too.
Absolutely. And like you said, that really was kind of a turning the page, because now we are officially moving toward the end phase of this trial.
Yeah.
So, as Sam mentioned, those two statements bookmarked a lot of information. We did hear from witnesses today. We always like to get you started with who those witnesses were. So let's run those down for you really quickly. There were 3 of them today. 2 witnesses we've heard from before, one who's new. We heard from Breanne Wilbur. She visited the Monon Trails on the day of the murders, and she testified about what she saw. Brian Harshman, he's an Indiana State Police detective. We'll tell you about him in a little bit. And then Dr. John Martin, he is a psychiatrist, and he was the new witness for today, and certainly a witness that was key, brought not by the defense, but by the state. So let's start off by talking about the fact that the defense rested their case today and kind of what happened at that point. It really took everybody by surprise. As soon as Brad Rosie said the defense rests, at that point there was a sidebar conversation that the prosecutor requested, wanted to speak to the judge and to the defense off on the side. They talked, came back a few minutes later. The judge informed the jury, hey, we were not expecting this to happen quite so quickly. So the judge asked the jury to leave because she didn't want them sitting around in the courtroom, because at that point, really the state was scrambling to bring the witnesses that they wanted to speak to the jury. They weren't expecting that to happen until this afternoon. So we had about an hour and 45-minute delay in the courtroom waiting for the state's witnesses to come. And during that time, the judge wanted to try to make the best use of that time while the jury was out of the courtroom. So she was hoping to be able to talk to both the state and the defense about jury instructions and getting those kind of squared away in preparation for what's going to be happening next. But she said to both sides, I wasn't expecting to have this conversation so early. So she passed out a proposed set of jury instructions to both the state and the defense, gave them a chance to take a look at it. Again, this was a moment the jury looked surprised, the judge looked surprised, the state looked surprised, everyone in the gallery was surprised, not expecting things to wrap up for the defense witnesses quite this soon.
Yeah, and like you said, that was just minutes into this morning, right? It was, 9:10 that all of this happened too. And I think the reason this was so important, and maybe the reason the defense felt so confident that they were done with their case, is because of how strong Tuesday was for the defense. Tuesday was such an important day for Richard Allen and his attorneys inside this Carroll County courtroom. In fact, fact, I want to recap. If you weren't with us yesterday, I want to mention quickly 3 important witnesses that the defense called yesterday supporting their arguments in this case. Let me start first with a psychiatrist who told the jurors, who told the court yesterday that Richard Allen was, quote, absolutely showing signs of delirium while he was in prison just a few months ago. We also heard from a forensic scientist who specialized in firearms and crime scene reconstruction. He talked a lot about that cartridge that was found between the bodies of Abby Williams and Libby German at the crime scene when the girls were found. On Tuesday, we also heard from a digital examiner who gave us brand new digital data in this case. And this was perhaps the most talked about information that came out of court Tuesday. This examiner went back through the data that state police had access to in October of 2017, and she says someone used the headphone jack on Libby German's phone to insert a headphone or some kind of audio cord and then took it out 5 hours later. That was the first time we had ever heard that information, brand new information yesterday. So again, a very strong day for the defense Tuesday. Wednesday morning, they come in and say, we're done.
So we had 12 days of testimony presented by the state, 4 days of testimony presented by the defense. So I will send it back to you, Scott, right now, because we're just curious to hear from Katie about her take on this. Everyone was surprised that the defense rested after just 4 days of testimony.
All right, Bob and Sam will be getting to you shortly. Let's go ahead and reintroduce Katie Jackson Lindsay. She is a former deputy prosecutor, currently a criminal defense attorney. She's been with us every day of this case. Were you surprised when you heard this morning from the defense saying, we're done?
No, I wasn't surprised. As a defense attorney, I was not surprised, because what we have to remember is that the defense has no burden. If they are going to put on a case and they don't have to, their case should simply be raising reasonable doubt or highlighting reasonable doubt within the state's case. And so what we saw with their case was that it didn't tell a story, it wasn't necessarily cohesive in the way the state's case was, but they put on the witnesses that they need to put on to hit the points that they needed to hit. And just like Sam said, they had a strong day yesterday. They've hit every major topic, and so there's no reason to prolong their case.
In your opinion, do you feel as though the defense has raised reasonable doubt for this jury to acquit Richard Allen of these murders?
I do think that they have. I mean, the biggest things that the state had would have been first starting with those eyewitnesses. None of those witnesses identified Richard Allen. Not a single one of those witnesses from the bridge pointed to him and said, that's the guy I saw on the bridge. I think that that was very impactful without them even having to put on witnesses to refute that fact. And then we heard a lot of testimony about his mental state as it relates to those confessions. Those confessions are a big part of the state's case. I would argue they are the state's case. And we heard from the defense witnesses saying that he made those confessions when he was in a state of delirium. He made those confessions under very trying, challenging conditions that will cause anyone to lose their mind. And so I think they were effective in that regard. And then yesterday, they attacked the bullet, which they sort of, through cross-examination on the state's case, challenged the state's witnesses and their science used to reach those conclusions. But yesterday, they put their own witness on that said, you know, I'm not saying that this person was not qualified to reach these conclusions, but what I'm saying is that her methodology was flawed. She compared apples to oranges instead of apples to apples. And so her conclusions are not something that I think were sufficient. And then finally, their last witness cast doubt on what was going on with that cell phone. And that might not seem like a really big thing, but what that did, I think, was effectively challenge the state's entire timeline of when these crimes were committed, were the girls' bodies moved, and who was dealing with that cell phone. So I think effectively they have raised doubt. They've given the jury some things to think about, and they've really caused some problems for the state's case. In
case you're wondering why Richard Allen wasn't called to be a witness in this particular case, tell our viewers why you think that wouldn't have been a smart move.
Well, we have to always remember, again, they don't have any burden. They don't have to put on any case, right? And so then they have to balance that against Richard Allen's right to remain silent throughout the end of this trial. And so when, as a defense attorney, when you're weighing whether or not to call your client as a witness, what you really have to analyze is, what does he have to add? What could he put into evidence at this point that the jury has not already heard? We've already heard him tell his version of what happened that day when he was on the bridge. We've already heard him admit or allegedly confess to the crime, and we've heard the conditions under which that happened and his mental state at the time. And effectively, we've heard him say, I did not do it. And so when they are balancing the cost-benefit analysis of putting him on the stand and subjecting him to cross-examination and having the jury put him under a microscope and judge him, there's really not more that he can add. And so I think they ultimately decided that there was no advantage to doing that.
All right, we're going to hear more from Katie in a moment. Let's get back to Bob and Sam in Carroll County. And guys, let's talk a little bit about the witnesses the jury heard from today.
The first two witnesses, both witnesses that the jury has heard from before, and I'll tell you straight up front, they were not on the stand for very long. Both of them were on the witness stand for less than 5 minutes. Brianne Wilbur, she walked on the trail on the afternoon of the murders. She previously had told the jury that she was there in the early afternoon, and she took some photos, posted them to Instagram. One of those photos was entered into evidence today to show the jury. She was asked by the state if she saw any other girls like Abby or Libby on the trail that day, asked if she saw Bridge Guy. She said she did not. That was essentially the end of testimony that we heard from Brianne Wilbur. And then the state moved on to Indiana State Police Detective Brian Harshman. He previously testified that he has listened to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of Richard Allen's prison phone calls and seen the videos. Basically, he was positioned as the one person, perhaps other than Richard Allen's family, who has heard his voice more than anyone else, especially over the last 2 years. And he also told the jury when he was asked, do you recognize the voice on the Bridge Guy video taken on the cell phone of Libby German? He said, yeah, I recognize that voice. It's the voice of Richard Allen. So he's really the one witness from the state who, from his testimony, has identified Richard Allen as being at the crime scene. Today he was asked about something different. He was asked about Richard Allen's time in prison, and he was asked to compare the location and the space, the cells that he was staying in, both at Westville Correctional Facility as well as Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, and most recently at the Cass County Jail. And he said basically the spaces he was in during all that time was the same. It was a small one-person cell in solitary confinement, not having a lot of communication with other inmates. He said he actually had more communication at Westville than he does at the Cass County Jail. To me, it seemed that the state was asking those questions to try and establish the fact, hey, look, you know, the defense has tried to make the argument that when he was at Westville, he was in a state of psychosis and was not in his right mind when he made the confessions. But essentially now in the Cass County Jail, you know, he's been in the same situation and he's not in psychosis there. So I think they're trying to establish the really the framework that just the way in which he's been held and the conditions in which he's been held does not explain the confessions. And I expect that we'll hear more about that tomorrow. The big witness, though, that we heard from today, the most important witness that we heard from today, Dr. John Martin, the psychiatrist, who has spent between 13 and 18 days visiting with Richard Allen over the course of the roughly year and a half that he was at the Westville facility. And I want to start off with some extraordinary testimony. Keep in mind, this was a state witness. Yeah. The state putting him on the stand, and it was fascinating the way that his testimony started. And I want to read a little bit of that. He was asked about the fact that Richard Allen was in solitary confinement and the impact that that has on an inmate's mental state. And Dr. Martin pointed out, he said that there is an insinuation when someone is placed in solitary confinement that it's because they did something wrong in prison. They're put there as an extra form of punishment. And Dr. Martin said, and I'll quote here, he said, Mr. Allen had not done anything wrong, and yet he was being treated as if he had done something wrong. That was not right. An interesting statement from a state witness saying that the way he was being held in solitary confinement for a very long period of time, in his words, not right. Yeah. But he then pointed out that the prison had a responsibility because he was in safekeeper status, which means the reason he was sent to the state prison to begin with is because they felt they couldn't keep him safe in a local county jail, and he needed to be kept away from the general population there, and that's why he was kept in such lockdown, harsh conditions in that individual cell. So, but it started off with interesting testimony from Dr. Martin pointing out that he did not necessarily seem to agree with the conditions that Richard Allen was living in during certainly most of the first year that he was at Westville. Then he went on to talk about his meetings with Richard Allen. He acknowledged that he didn't see him very often, but he first saw him in November of 2022 when Richard Allen first came to Westville. He said at that point he described him as stable, fine, no problems. He saw him again then in January of 2023, and at that time he said he was doing well enough that he's only required to see inmates once every 3 months. So he scheduled the next visit with him for late April of 2023, but he had to see him before that because he got a call from the prison saying Richard Allen was not doing well, that he was laying in his cell naked, rolling around in his feces, that he was eating his own feces. So he went to visit him. That was on April 13th. And at that point, he diagnosed Richard Allen as being psychotic. And he and a group of psychologists determined the best way to treat that was to involuntarily give Richard Allen some medication, antipsychotic medication. They said he wasn't in a state at that point to really even be making decisions in his own best interest, so they made a decision to give him that medication. And then Dr. Martin saw him consecutively for 5 days in a row. He said April 18th, after having several days of the medication, Richard Allen was still psychotic. April 25th, still psychotic but doing better. And then he saw him for about once a week for the next month and a half. And he said on May 2nd, May 8th, May 23rd, May 30th, and June 20th, he said no evidence of psychosis at all. At all that he saw in Richard Allen. And of course, that's really important because during that time frame is when Richard Allen made a lot of his confessions, saying that he killed Abby and Libby, and he told that to the prison guards. He told that to the psychologist that was there. Yeah. He even made a confession to Dr. Martin on June 20th. He said, Dr. Martin said that Richard Allen told him, I would like to apologize to the families of his victims. So the testimony from Dr. Martin, pretty powerful today, saying from his standpoint, there was no psychosis throughout May and throughout June, which is very different from the testimony that we've heard over the last few days from defense witnesses saying he absolutely was psychotic. And then we got to the cross-examination, and that's when things really turned a little bit as far as the testimony.
Yeah, so keep in mind that first part, supporting the state's arguments that Richard Allen was in the right state of mind when he made these alleged confessions to killing the girls. But again, when the defense crossed and talked to Dr. Martin again, they played a video. They played a video from June 20th, 2023, which Dr. Martin said he met with Richard Allen on that day.
Same day that he got a confession, or that he
Same
heard a
day.
confession, right?
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is more than a month after he determined that Richard Allen wasn't showing any signs of psychosis at this point. So they put this video up on the screen. About most of the courtroom, I would say, could see it. Bob and I could see it from where we were seated. And it showed Richard Allen inside the prison getting some sort of medical exam.
Yes.
He was seated in the middle of this room. He was restrained. His chest was restrained to the chair. His hands were cuffed at his waist. And Richard Allen just looked dazed. He looked confused. He was emotionless. He was barely responsive to any of the people who were with him in the room. At one point, he even slumps forward. A guard who's with him kind of lifts him back up into the chair and puts his hand on his shoulder to kind of keep him in place there. No blinking. He was just staring, seemed very out of it, I would say. So at that point, we watch a few minutes of the video. Defense attorney Rosie shares with the courtroom that the video is about 20 minutes long.
Right.
He had intended on playing 8 minutes of that for everyone in the courtroom today, but they only got through a few minutes of it before the judge asked for a sidebar. They came back from the sidebar. We didn't see any more of that video. But this witness, Dr. Martin, was asked really several times from a couple different people, after seeing that video, does it make you change your mind? Does it make you reconsider your statement that Richard Allen wasn't psychotic at that point? He never really gave us a good answer.
Well,
Depending on who asked the question, it was kind of back and forth.
we got multiple answers. The
Right.
first time he was asked that question was by Stacey Diener, one of the deputy prosecuting attorneys, and she said, anything in that video that you just saw, does that make you change your mind in a report that you wrote
Right.
on June 20th, that day? You wrote a report and said he was not psychotic and did not show any signs of psychosis. Anything you just saw in that video changed your mind? He said no.
Yeah.
Then, on cross-examination, just about 5 minutes later, he was essentially asked the same question
Yeah.
by defense attorney Brad Rosie. And he said, does that video make you want to perhaps change your diagnosis of what you saw that day? And Dr. Martin said,
Yes.
yes. He said, yes, it does. And
Yeah.
then redirect again, going back to Stacey Diener. She said, I want to clarify here. When you look at that video, does he look psychotic there? And he said no. And she stopped him really quickly and said, okay, that's it. No more questions. And she moved on. So we got back and forth responses from Dr.
Yeah.
Martin. And you have to wonder what the jury made of that.
Yeah, and just like so many other witnesses, again today they asked great questions to some of these witnesses. And one of the jurors asked specifically, do you think it's possible that Richard Allen could have been in and out of psychosis during that 24-hour period where, yes, Dr. Martin met with him. Yes, we heard this confession. Yes, we saw this video of him getting medical treatment. Do you think he could have been in and out? And Dr. Martin said yes.
It is possible. That's what he
Yeah.
said. And just in general, the jury asked, is it possible that a patient who is psychotic can be in and out of psychosis within a general 24-hour period? And he said, yeah, that's possible, which then raises questions about all those other dates
Right.
that he found Richard Allen, that he said he was not psychotic, because on the morning of June 20th, we know Dr. Martin said that he met with Richard Allen very early that morning. So by the time he was in the chair,
Yeah, so I think all of this to say, I mean, Dr. Martin was our final witness of this case.
Yes,
The
yes.
final moments of testimony. He was called by the state, and this was probably not what the state was hoping for. It was not a home run for the state by any means.
No, it really wasn't.
Yeah.
Scott, we'll send it back to you, and Katie, be interested to hear her take on that testimony today.
All right, Bob and Samantha, thanks so much. We'll get back to you in just a second. Let's bring in Katie, find out what you thought about Dr. Martin's testimony as the way that Bob and Samantha described it.
Well, I would agree with Bob and Samantha that it doesn't seem that it was a home run for the state by any means. It's almost another one of those scenarios where you wonder if they asked questions that they weren't prepared for the answers for. Because certainly with a rebuttal witness, you don't want to call a rebuttal witness that just corroborates the state's evidence. I'm sorry, the defense's evidence. You want to call, as a prosecutor, a rebuttal witness who will poke holes in what the defense just presented. And in some ways, he completely corroborated the defense's position. I think it's a very big deal that he made the statement that the conditions under which Richard Allen were kept were just not right. They weren't right for someone who was simply accused of a crime. And then he goes on to give these opinions that it sounds like the defense was effective in getting him to backtrack on in terms of whether he actually was sure that Richard Allen was in a state of psychosis. And so the reason this is really important, and even with the back and forth, it's still really effective for the defense, is because remember what we've talked about throughout the trial is that the jury has an instruction that if the evidence lends itself to two reasonable interpretations, they have to choose the one consistent with Richard Allen's innocence. And so now they have evidence in the record from the first set of state's doctors that said he was not in a state of psychosis. Then they have evidence in the record from defense witnesses, qualified defense witnesses who have testified for both sides saying, no, he was in a state of psychosis. And now they have their final witness from the state saying, I'm just really not sure. And so in reconciling that, the jury has two reasonable possibilities. And if they follow the instructions of the court, they should decide the one that is consistent with his innocence, which is that he was in a state of psychosis, and these are not actual confessions, they're false confessions.
Do you believe, Katie, that this case is going to boil down to Richard Allen's mental health and the confessions and these psychiatrists that we've been hearing? Is that where this jury is probably going to land in terms of whether or not to find him guilty or not?
I think that's a really strong possibility. We've said over and over that it's really hard to convince a jury that your client didn't do something that they are admitting to doing. And so I think there's absolutely reasonable doubt as it relates to the bullet. And before these alleged confessions, that was the only thing that put Richard Allen at this crime scene. There's absolutely reasonable doubt in terms of the identity descriptions that were given from the witnesses who were actually around the scene that day. And so what it really comes down to is his own alleged admissions. And does the jury believe those were true confessions, or does the jury believe they were false confessions as a result of psychosis?
Right. Because as you remember from the very beginning of this trial, those witnesses that the state brought up, they were describing a man that doesn't appear to be Richard Allen.
Exactly.
They were describing a tall, muscular man in his 20s with brown, poofy hair.
Yes.
And that's not Richard Allen. He's 40 and shorter and a little heavier. That was the state's first witnesses. And then this so-called magic bullet that was found, which was a cartridge that was cycled through what the state believed was Richard Allen's gun, discovered later on at his home. You know, there's been some, speculation as to where that bullet came from. And then there was no DNA of Richard Allen's found at the crime scene on these girls,
right,
and no DNA of the girls found in Richard Allen's home when they went in and found knives and a gun and that kind of thing.
Exactly. I mean, really, Scott, you just sort of did their closing arguments, right? Did the defense's closing arguments. And when all of those things on balance, the jury has to have doubt as it relates to the state's case and how solid the state's case is. And so they have to be really relying on those confessions.
Right.
And so I think what the defense has been able to put on, and then coincidentally, what the state has put on today has just cast more doubt on the validity of those confessions.
Before we get back to Bob and Sam, I want to ask you one last question about this Indiana State Police detective who listened to hundreds of hours of Richard Allen phone calls. And he was, as I remember, was the only one who was asked in court, can you identify the voice that you heard on the, down the hill video, the one that we've showed lots of times here on Channel 13. And he was the only one who said, yes, I recognize that voice. That voice is Richard Allen. But the other state and defense witnesses were not asked to say, do you recognize the voice on the down the hill cell phone video on Libby's phone? They were not asked. So really it's one person who is connecting Richard Allen to the Down the Hill video, right?
Exactly. And what is even more curious about that strategy is that he is the only person who only heard Richard Allen's recorded voice. We've heard from a number of people who spoke to Richard Allen in person, face to face, and the state chose not to ask a single one of those people whether or not they recognized his voice as compared to that video. And I think this could really hurt the state because when the video was first played for the jury, we heard a lot of testimony about how that video had been manipulated in a way to isolate the sound or to keep the video from moving. And we didn't hear any testimony about how that would affect the quality of that sound or how it could potentially modify the sound on the video. And I don't know, maybe that's not a thing, but I think strategically it should have been important for the jury to understand that this is actually how the voice would have sounded. And they didn't do that. And so I think that was a missed opportunity in terms of tying up his voice later. And again, they didn't ask anyone who spoke to him face to face whether or not they could identify his voice on that video.
So this jury will likely get this case at some point on Thursday. Yes. I know it's impossible to guess what this jury may be thinking and what they may be deliberating, but what are your thoughts when they get this jury? Is this likely to be a quick verdict? Is there a possibility of a hung jury? What do you think?
Well, they've heard a lot of evidence, right? And so I think considering the seriousness of the case, the respect for these young girls who have lost their life for whatever reason, senselessly, right? I think they will take the time to review the evidence. And so that in itself will take some time. But in terms of the deliberations, it really just depends on where they are right now. If they are all on one accord in terms of deciding that the state has not met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, we'll get a quick verdict. But on the other hand, based on their questions, we can kind of get an idea that they're not all on the same page. They're sort of all across the board in terms of what they're thinking. And so I think it'll probably take a while.
All right, Katie, thank you again for your insight. Let's get back over to Bob and Sam and find out from you what is next tomorrow, Thursday.
Well, you were just talking about how difficult it's going to be for the jury to kind of sort through all the evidence. And I do think that this jury they've been so inquisitive, they've been so curious. They're kudos to them. They are really taking this weighty responsibility very seriously. We know that they have heard from 64 separate witnesses between the state and the defense. We know that they have almost 400 exhibits that they have been asked to review. They'll have those exhibits at their fingertips. So yes, this is, it may take them, if simply just reviewing all of that is part of their responsibility, we expect that's going to take a while.
Yeah, and to your point too, I mean, there was concern long before we actually got to trial about can we find an impartial jury? Can we find people who are going to take this seriously, who are going to be invested despite the difficult, brutal content being sequestered for more than a month now, right? But talking about how involved they've been and asking the questions. And now we're to this chapter where we are going to hear from both sides, closing arguments, and then it's up to them. This is really their time.
It is. To give you an idea what's going to happen tomorrow, the judge asked both sides to be ready to go at 9 a.m. to present the closing arguments. We know that the state will go first, and the state will get up to 2.5 hours to present its closing arguments. Then we're told there will be a break. Then it will be the defense's turn. They will get up to 2.5 hours as well. And then the state will get the last word, one more shot at talking to the jury before the jury will then get instructions from the judge. And those will be very detailed instructions that they will get on how to conduct their deliberations. We heard, for example, one of those things that was discussed by both sides today, a reminder to the jury, as Katie was mentioning, Richard Allen is choosing not to take the witness stand. He did not take the witness stand. The jury will be instructed that he's not required to do that. He has the right not to take the witness stand. and that should not be held against him. So that is one of many instructions that the jury will get in this case, and then it's off to deliberations.
So we know that could happen, like Scott mentioned, as early as tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of unknowns. Could the jury deliberate on Sunday, for example, if we get that long? Is there going to be a cutoff time per day to kind of allow them some time off? What does that look like? We still don't know. One thing we do know is that, like we mentioned, it could start as early as tomorrow, jury deliberations. We hear from the state, like you mentioned. We'll take a break. We'll hear from the defense, state one more time. And then from there, we'll be ready. We'll be ready and we'll be here.
Yes. We've been here for the better part of a month so far, and as we are nearing the end of this trial, and especially once we are awaiting a verdict, 13 News will be here. We are lined up every day. We have a media credential to be inside the courtroom for many days. On days we don't, we line up with everyone else to be able to have a seat inside the courtroom. So we are gearing up for the very end phase of this trial.
Yeah, and I think just quickly, Scott, before we end, something else that's important to mention is today I talked to a woman who was outside the courthouse. She was holding a sign, and the sign said, "The world is watching." And the world is watching. There's international media here in Carroll County, Indiana, because of the intensity and the drive behind getting justice at the end of the day for Abby Williams and Libby German, and that we are finally in this final chapter.
And we heard in the very first days of this trial, one of the witnesses say the one thing about these events is it has turned Delphi and everyone in it upside down.
Yeah.
So this town is looking for answers, looking for closure. We are expecting here within the next few days, we will hear back from the jury, and we will see if some closure is just around the corner. Scott, we will send it back to you, and again, we will be out here 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to bring you the closing arguments here in the Delphi murders case.
All right, Bob Siegel and Samantha Johnson doing such a remarkable job. There are no cameras allowed in this trial inside the courtroom, but watching Bob and Samantha, and when Emily Longnecker has been there, it is as if we are inside the court. We are hearing remarkable details every night here on the Delphi Debrief. Thank you so much again for your work. We're going to be breaking down the Delphi murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR+. You can also find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial, by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. You can also scan that QR code. Thanks so much for joining us.